Welcome to the I Told You So podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Kohl. I started this podcast because I noticed an erosion of societal discourse and how normal conversations are often fueled by polarization. The I Told You So podcast offers an opportunity for healthy discourse and effective debate. I select topics to discuss and debate with listeners and guests of the I Told You So podcast. Listeners and guests predict what will happen in the future, and I track predictions and announce who predicted accurately when those predictions become true. The podcast offers topics where listeners and guests can discuss and debate with the goal of predicting the future so they can proudly say, I told you so. My guest for this episode is Dr. Antonina Broyaka. Dr. Antonina Broyaka is from Ukraine. Dr. Broyaka earned a PhD in agricultural economics and was an associate professor in Ukraine. From 1998 to 2022, Dr. Broyaka carried out scientific and educational activities at the Vinnytsia National Agrarian University in Ukraine, where she became associate dean for research and then dean of the Faculty of Economics and Entrepreneurship. Dr. Broyaka's name has been on more than 60 publications of educational and methodological nature and has over 70 scientific publications. In her research, Dr. Broyaka focuses on the development of the agro-industrial sector, agricultural extension service, food security, grain markets, and agricultural foreign trade. She pays considerable attention to international cooperation and experience exchange. Earlier in her career, she participated in several scholarship programs in the USA, such as the Faculty Exchange Program at USDA, that's the United States Department of Agriculture, and Pennsylvania State University, and the Fulbright Junior Faculty Development Program at Kansas State University. Dr. Broyaka was also involved in the USAID, and that's the United States Agency for International Development. She was involved in international technical assistance projects at her home university in Ukraine and collaborated with Louisiana State University in the US. Dr. Broyaka established good professional relations with American colleagues, which helped to continue her career in the US. After the beginning of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, she and her two children found refuge in Manhattan, Kansas. Now, Dr. Broyaka is an extension associate for the Agricultural Economics Department at Kansas State University, where she conducts research activity on issues of economic impact of Russian military aggression on Ukrainian agriculture and Black Sea grain markets and global food security and trade. She is involved in several USDA and USAID international projects aimed to improve grain production and supply chain. She's been invited to speak at many prestigious conferences in the US and abroad, such as the Norman Borlaug International Dialogue, Agriculture Supply Chain Asia, Kansas Governor Agriculture Summit, Tri-State Grain Growers Convention, Distillers Grain Symposium, and many others. I'm delighted to have Dr. Broyaka on the I Told You So podcast. On this episode, Dr. Antonina Broyaka and I discussed the current and future influence of the Russian war in Ukraine, specifically on agriculture. So, thanks for being with us today, Dr. Broyaka. Let's start by letting us know a little about your background. What brought you to the US from Ukraine, and what were you doing in Ukraine, and what are you working on now in the US?
Yeah, as you mentioned, unfortunately, Russian war in Ukraine forced me to leave my country, first of all, in order to protect my children. And I remember the day on February 24th, 2022, we woke up from bombing. We couldn't understand what was going on. Our windows were shaking and sirens went off. Then we turned TV and found that the war started. You know, I still, when I speak about this, I'm kind of shaken going on. through all this experience over and over. We couldn't understand and comprehend that that is the reality. We found that all Ukraine was in fire, including our city. We couldn't believe that that can happen in the middle of Europe, in 21st century. And, anyone would believe. And yes, the West warned us that Putin was going to attack us, but my mind still not accepting this, that can happen. And when even that the war is coming, you cannot be prepared, never. You can never comprehend the full horror of the war before it comes to your own house. And this is what I know for sure now. So that morning, my phone was blowing up. As you mentioned, I was a dean, and all heads of departments, faculties, students, and parents started to call me. Nobody knew what to do. Then we had an emergency meeting with the president of the university and university administration. So we canceled all classes, we sent home all faculty and staff, and started to evacuate students from dorms. But as administrator, I needed to be at work while my children were alone at home, and they were scared to death, calling me and crying. So that was, for me as a mom, is just heartbroken. The beginning of the war was so intense that after the few days, Russians entered Kiev, and were moving further. We were afraid that in a few days they will be in our city. It was really scary. Our city is just few hours from Kiev. It's like from Manhattan, from here to Kansas City, let's say, just several hours of drive. And during one night, which we spent in a bomb shelter, listening for all the sounds, how military airplanes and drones fly and shooting. My husband told me that in the morning I need to take the children and run as far as I can, and he will stay to protect our home. So after several days of exhausting travel to the west, we finally got to Poland. It was very difficult and scary trip. You probably saw news on TV at the beginning of the war about thousands of Ukrainian refugees, mainly women and children, that were literally walking to Western border. So me and my children were among those people. That was tough. And so actually, when the war started, I received many messages from my friends and colleagues in the US. As you mentioned, I had a lot of professional connections here that I made during my exchange program that I've been on. And they were worried about what is going on in Ukraine because that was such a limited information here. And they asked me, how am I doing and how is my family and what is going on? So they proposed me some support if I would manage to come here. Of course, that was very difficult decision, and because I was happy and successful in my country, and I never thought that I'm gonna leave it. But the thought that something can happen, something bad can happen to my kids, forced me to make this decision. As a mom, I cannot imagine how you could live after if something happens to your kids, to my kids. And if something bad happened to me, for example, also, how would they survive? Since the beginning of the war, actually, around 35,000 civilian victims have been documented in Ukraine. Among them, almost 2,000 children killed or injured. 20,000 children were stolen and illegally deported to Russia, where their names were changed. Many of them were adopted by new family. And this is not just children from foster houses. That can be children that were taken from parents. So, how can you live with that if something terrible happens to your child? So I wouldn't be able to. That's why I'm here, right? And I really, really appreciate all the help and support my family received from wonderful Manhattan community and Kansas State University. We came literally with nothing, just with backpacks what we were able to carry running, from bombing. And people here shared with us food, clothes, children went to school, I got a job. And we actually started all our life over. Of course, this is not easy, but I don't regret. And if I would need to do this again, I would do it because nothing can be important than children's life, right? So what I'm doing now I work, as you mentioned, at K-State, at the Department of Agricultural Economics. I studied the economic impact of Russian military aggression on Ukrainian agriculture, particularly world grain markets and global food security. There is a lot of interest to Black Sea region grain and oilseed production and trade due to the war. Because Ukraine and Russia together were top producers and exporters on the grain market, and this created a lot of food insecurity issues. Also, together with my colleagues, we carry out several USDA and USAID projects. Two of them are in Georgia, the country, and Armenia regarding increasing their self-sufficient in wheat and flour production. And also now I'm involved in the USAID Ukraine Harvest Project aimed to return production and income of wheat, corn, barley, sunflower, and soybeans in Ukraine, at least to the pre-war level. So this is what I do.
Wow. Incredible story. Oh my. So, what do you think the influence is of the Russian war in Ukraine, especially on the grain market on a global scale? And do you think this impacts U.S. agriculture as well?
So, Ukraine was always known as a world breadbasket. Ukraine has the highest share of arable land in the world, 57%, and the most fertile black soil, very rich soil. So that's why we are able to produce much more than we consume. So production and export of grain and oilseed are the most important industries that fill the budget of Ukraine, feed Ukrainians, and many other nations. Despite the war, Ukraine still keeps a leading position in world agricultural export. Ukraine remains first on sunflower oil and meal markets, and we also became first on sunflower seed export. We are third on rapeseed market, fourth on corn market, and fifth on barley market, and sixth on soybean and wheat markets. So as you understand, the importance of Ukraine on a global grain market is pretty huge, right? However, the volume of our grain production and consequently export decreased significantly since the beginning of the war. As a result of Russian invasion, annual crop acreage declined for over 30% due to the loss of territories and also active military hostilities on some territories and mines that left on the field. And we need to do a lot of demining to return land to cultivation. So if in 2022, Ukraine harvested almost 16 million hectares of grain crops, in 2023, we were able to harvest only 10.8 million hectares. And as a result, grain production decreased from 86 million tons in 2021 to 60 in 2023, which is actually better than in 2022 when we produced just 54 million tons of grain. So in particular, the most important crop that is, of course, wheat and corn, So if in 2022 we produced 42 million tons of corn, in 2022 it was only 27 million. In 2023 we harvested 31 million tons. Regarding wheat, in 2021 we produced 32 million tons. Then in 2022 production declined to 20 million tons. And then in 2023, we harvested 21.5 million tons. So you can see how big this difference, right? So as a result, grain export in 2022 decreased by 24% compared to pre-war level. And this immediately raised the issue of global food security and risk of famine in import-dependent countries, especially in Africa, who traditionally were main buyers of grain from Ukraine. In 2023, due to opening of the Ukrainian humanitarian corridor from the three big Odessa Black Sea ports, our grain export increased, but it's still 15% less compared to pre-war level. So the main point that Ukraine is still self-sufficient in grain production, but our production is not profitable for the third year already in a row due to high input costs, expensive and very complicated logistics, both internally and externally, shortage of labor because many people left the country, many men served in army. So there is a shortage of labor and other resources, plus everyday danger, right, that you need to face. Since the beginning of the war, Ukraine also suffers from very high level of inflation. Although we still produce enough to feed ourselves, decline in real purchasing power makes food less affordable. On average, food has become 33% more expensive since the beginning of the war. So don't complain when Americans say like just 6% food inflation in America, right? So our prices are much more higher. As a result, the global food security index in 2022 for Ukraine declined from 58 to 71. Below even countries where Ukraine would usually export food. We are now below India, Algeria, Philippines, Colombia, Indonesia, Tunisia, South Africa, and other food insecure countries. Can you imagine that Ukraine, the world breadbasket, now below those food insecure countries? So again, as lower our production, as lower our export. Shortage of grain from the Black Sea region directly affects world grain prices and indirectly food prices. We all remember when during the first few months of the war, due to Russian blockade of Ukrainian Black Sea ports, prices for grain increased enormously. If before the war, wheat price on a world market was around $315, $330 per ton, in March 2022, 1 ton of wheat cost from $450 to $540 per ton. Would African countries afford that? No. For corn, if before the war, the price was around $230, $250 per ton. In March 2022, it increased up to $400 per ton. Of course, this immediately reflected in food prices, especially bread and meat, where grain is needed for the production process. Later, after the situation with grain export logistics from Ukraine had relatively stabilized, it's still kind of, everyday challenge, but relatively stabilized, prices began to decline. Now we observe pretty low prices for grain, which is good for consumers, but not really good for producers. Therefore, eventually they will gradually push the prices up to cover their losses. Does the war impact US agriculture? Of course. Just because missiles don't land on your land doesn't mean the war isn't affecting your agriculture. World prices impact American prices as well. We are on an open market. You cannot be isolated in a modern open economy, right? And farmers, traders, processors have to adjust to the world grain prices. And if the war in Ukraine continues, we will observe another wave of inflation. Another issue, fertilizers. This is not a secret that Russia is one of the biggest producers and exporters of nitrogen-containing potash and phosphate fertilizers. Since the beginning of the war, export of fertilizers from Russia decreased. I would like to emphasize that there is no sanctions on fertilizer export from Russia, but they became more expensive. Also, fertilizer prices in Europe also increased due to a sharp increase in gas prices. As a result, they are decreasing fertilizer production. This hit European farmers, American farmers hard, while farmers elsewhere, especially in Africa, are stopping using fertilizer in general, reducing yield and deepening the global food prices. So this is what we need to think about for future.
Wow. So a tremendous impact that this Russian war in Ukraine has had in the past few years, I think over 3 years now. And
2.5.
yeah, and it'll, if the war doesn't end, it'll just continue. So speaking of the war ending, how do you think the Russian war in Ukraine will end?
Unfortunately, no one can predict for sure how the war and when the war will end. To me, there are 3 scenarios. I don't like some of them. First is the best for Ukraine and best for all democratic world, that Ukraine wins and wins this war and returns all the territories according to officially recognized borders. I mean borders before 2014 Russian invasion to Crimea and Donbass, because the war for us is not just since 2022, but since 2014, already 10 years. And it is possible if the West stops being afraid to confront Putin and will stop doing business with terrorist country that does not respect any international law. So that is first scenario. Second, long-term conflict or frozen conflict. If the West continues to help Ukraine, but in an amount just sufficient only to keep fighting, not lose, but not enough to win. Me personally and all Ukrainians, I really appreciate all the support we receive from international community, and this means a lot. But very often, unfortunately, this support comes too slowly or too late. And such delay cost Ukraine thousands of lost lives, destroyed homes and infrastructure. As for now, more than 50% of Ukrainian power plants are damaged. I spoke to my parents. They told they more don't have light that they have. I mean, electricity. So like they have light for 2 hours and don't have for 6 hours, and again have like light electricity for 2 hours, and then again like for 10 hours no electricity. So all food is spoiled in a refrigerator, right? If there is no electricity, pumping water doesn't work, you know. There is no heating, no cooling. So that creates a lot of problem, especially when we get closer to the winter time. So I hope that this gonna be more first scenario rather than second or third, because third, this is the worst scenario if Ukraine fails. And this can happen if West will stop supporting Ukraine. But then, unfortunately, it's going to be to the end of all democratic world. This will be a signal to other dictators that if you have weapons, you can easily come and take whatever you want from your neighbor, and they will not be punished for that. Then I'm confident that Russia will go further to Poland, Baltic countries, Moldova, and they tell us nothing gonna stop them. So then it can be just Third World War. And on my opinion, now we're in that stage where we need to choose and decide where the world need to be in several years.
Yeah, it's unbelievable to think about, really, that we're in this situation right now, and really appreciate your comments. Really grateful that you're able to share that testimony of you leaving Ukraine with your children and how much they mean to you. Your husband staying back. So just a powerful, heartfelt experience that you had. And so I'm grateful that you're using the experience and knowledge that you have to impact so many researchers here in the United States and globally, and help them to understand the consequences and the impact that's going on a global scale due to the Russian war in Ukraine, and that there are several people that around the world that are thinking about this and trying to think of how to protect agriculture, how to make our food more secure, and how to make sure that the agricultural economy stays strong. So, I'll just say I just really appreciate the work and effort that you're giving along with your colleagues. So, yeah, about the Russian war in Ukraine, yeah, it's hard to predict, right? And so it seems like there are some if-then scenarios. So I think the best that we can do is hopefully there's some diplomacy that takes place soon, and that involves the democracy governments, and that they can team together to find out a plan moving forward, discover a plan and implement on that plan. And who knows? In the United States, I mean, we're in the middle of what could be a massive change in how our government operates right now. So things could really change for us, and could be good, could be bad, but it's a change. And so that might have a role to play in how this war ends too. So
Sure.
but I agree with you. I think it will end. I think, and it'll have to eventually. Just don't know exactly how or exactly when. So, well, Dr. Broyaka, thanks so much for being a guest on the I Told You So podcast. So, if listeners want to learn more, have an interest, especially in agricultural influence, global agricultural influence, I'm sure that Dr. Broyaka would be happy to take an email message from you. You can simply email her at broyaka@ksu.edu. That's BROYAKA at ksu.edu. Now, because this podcast is about predicting the future, my questions to those listening are this. Here's one. Do you agree with Dr. Broyaka's assessment of the influence of the Russian war in Ukraine on agriculture in the U.S. and around the world. Why or why not? How will the Russian war in Ukraine impact global agriculture in the future? And when do you think, and how do you think the Russian war in Ukraine will end? So I'm very interested to know what you think. So please text or call me at 785-473-3721. That's 785-473-3721. You can send an email message to me as well, and that's ITYS at BenKohlITYS.com. That's ITYS at BenKohlITYS.com, or post on any of my social media channels. I do ask you to go to the I Told You So podcast website at BenKohlITYS.com, and there you can connect and get your own I Told You So items. We have a merchandise link for you to click on there. You can get shirts and hoodies and hats and coffee mugs or whatever else you like. The I Told You So podcast, I hope, is a space for healthy discourse and effective debate with the goal of predicting the future so you can proudly say, I told you so. Also, if your business or organization is interested in advertising on the I Told You So podcast, please let me know that too. So thanks for tuning in to the I Told You So podcast. And thanks again to my guest, Dr. Antonina Broyaka. Followers of the podcast are very important. So please follow, like, subscribe, and leave a comment, and give a high rating, and especially share with your friends. So I'll leave you with this. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Kohl, and I hope to hear from you soon.